Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gladney University, presented by the Gladney Center for Adoption. We are so excited to have you here with us today. We have a great group of you all here with us, so thank you for tuning in. My name is Ashley Ellington, and I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist here at Gladney. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. After the training, you will receive a survey link that pops up. You will need to complete this to get credit for the training. You can fill this out for your CEUs or certificates of completion. If you missed the link, don't worry, you will get an email tomorrow where you can fill out that same information. If you are requesting a CEU or a certificate of completion, it will take about 5 to 7 business days to get to you. And as always, if you have any questions during the presentation, be sure to put them in the chat and we'll make sure that Todd answers them for you. With that being said, we are thrilled to have the amazing Adam McCormick here to present with you all today. He is amazing, and I know you're going to learn so much from his presentation on empowering approaches with LGBTQ plus youth in foster care. So without further ado, I'm going to let Adam take it over from here.
Thanks so much, Ashley. It's great to be with everyone this morning. I'm going to get my screen shared here real quick. There we go. I'm really excited to be with you this morning. I'm really excited to talk about this population and this topic in particular. I've been studying LGBTQ plus youth, specifically in the Texas foster care system for about 13 or 14 years now, and actually come from the world of private foster care here in Texas. And years ago, a long time ago, in fact, my wife and I were just joking about this the other day. 20 years ago, she and I were house parents for a couple of years at a group home out in West Texas and lived with teenage boys. And having worked in that system, it became very evident that there was a lot more that we could do to better serve LGBTQ plus youth in the foster care system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that work, talk a little bit about specific things that we all can be doing to create a more affirming and inclusive system of care. So about every 30 minutes or so, I'll check in on the chat to see if there are any questions that are coming up. And of course, if I don't get any questions answered for you throughout the course of this presentation, you're always welcome to send me an email. I've got my email address here at St. Ed's. And I'll get back to you right away with answers to any questions that come up. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get going. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear me refer from time to time to SOGI. And when we talk about SOGI, here we're just referring to an individual's sexual orientation. And so, of course, sexual orientation are all matters of the heart, not just romantic relationships and sexual attraction, but emotional intimacy, connection, some of those sorts of things. Gender identity, matters of the brain, how we think about ourselves as it relates to male and female. And then gender expression, how we kind of show that to the world, both in terms of the outward things that we do, clothes and nails and hair, and but also, and I think probably just as important, and we're starting to have this conversation a little bit more in our society, but like emotional expression and vulnerability and those sorts of things that can all be related to that gender expression. So when you hear me refer to SOGI today, that's what I'll be talking about. But let's dive in. Let's get a sense of some of the statistics, some of the more general data that we know about LGBTQI plus youth, specifically LGBTQI plus youth who are in the foster care system or those who are vulnerable to being in the foster care system. So I think one of the most important things that we want to establish is that there is a disproportionate overrepresentation of LGBTQI youth in the foster care system. And this is something that just in the last 5 years or so, we've really got a much better sense of just how disproportionate that overrepresentation is. So we really have two good studies, none of them here in Texas, two really good studies with large samples of youth in foster care. And those two studies range from 20 to about 30% of teens in the foster care system reporting that they have LGBTQI plus identities. Now, when we compare that to studies of teens in the general population, that number almost always comes in around 10 to about 12%. So when we look at rate of disproportionality, unfortunately, there have been great researchers who have looked at rates of disproportionality with youth of color, especially Native American youth and Black youth in the foster care system, and they do such a great job of helping us to understand what this means in terms of disproportionality. For LGBTQI plus youth, what it means is that an LGBTQI youth, specifically teenager, today is anywhere between 2 to 3 times more likely to be in the foster care system than a non-LGBTQ plus youth. And there's a variety of factors and reasons that we look at that are going on that are contributing to that vulnerability and contributing to that overrepresentation. But I always look at this statistic. I always look at statistics around trafficking. A lot of people don't realize that LGBTQI plus youth, specifically those who have child welfare involvement or foster care involvement, are among, if not the most vulnerable group in our society to child trafficking. Between 60 to 75% of youth trafficking victims have a history of child welfare involvement, and many of those young people are LGBTQI plus youth. And when we look at, and I'm going to talk, and I'm starting to do this a little bit more because we're starting to understand the trafficking vulnerabilities of LGBTQI plus youth a little bit more. My colleagues and I just did a study that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation today, specifically with LGBTQI plus youth who have a history of foster care placement in their experiences and vulnerabilities around trafficking. But what we know is that 1 in 3 LGBTQI plus youth will be approached by a trafficker or somebody working for a trafficker within about 2 days of initially becoming homeless or being kicked out of their homes or running away from their homes or whatever other factor led to their being homeless. So um, we talk so much, and I think we should. We just finished Pride Month last month, and I know my family went to several events. And when we look at the data on just overall trends around acceptance of LGBTQI plus populations in general, and certainly with LGBTQI plus youth, there's a lot of wonderful things going on. I just saw a statistic last week that 70% of Americans support same-sex marriage, right? Marriage equality. That's up from 30% a decade ago, or just over a decade ago. One of the key statistics that we look at in research to help us understand what trends in acceptance look like for LGBTQI plus young people is the age at which young people come out, specifically lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth. And for years, really up until about 2016, 2017, that number dropped significantly. The average age at which young people came out at one point got as low as 15 and a half. Had we done this presentation 12, 13 years ago, it was adulthood, right? 21, 22 years old was the average coming out age. It was much less common for a teenager to come out to their family or to come out to their peers, to their teachers, whoever it might be. And so researchers oftentimes look at this statistic, the fact that the age at which youth are coming out, as being maybe one of the most seminal, one of the most important statistics to really kind of understand what these trends in acceptance uh, look look like. So I think that on a positive note, when we look at kind of affirmation and acceptance of LGBTQI plus youth, that's certainly a statistic that I think brings a lot of reason for celebration. At the same time, when we look at statistics like some of that we're going to talk about today, the overrepresentation of LGBTQI plus youth in the foster care system, the overrepresentation of LGBTQI plus youth in the juvenile justice system, where LGBTQI plus youth are twice as likely to be in juvenile justice and slightly even more likely to be incarcerated as juveniles. When we look at homelessness, this is the one where we see the greatest rate of disproportionality. Uh, Nationally, 40% of young people, teens or young adults who are homeless, are young people who have LGBTQI plus identities, and it's slightly higher here in Texas, right? And so their rate of disproportionality is going to be 4 times. That LGBTQI plus kids in the state of Texas are nearly 4 times as likely to be homeless as non-LGBTQI plus youth. So on one hand, we're seeing a lot of progress, a lot more acceptance, a lot more affirmation in all facets of society, especially within the family. But on the other hand, when we look at those systems like foster care, when we look at, dropout rates in the school system, when we look at rates of bullying in the school system, when we look at rates of homelessness, when we look at rates of trafficking, when we look at rates of juvenile incarceration, juvenile detention involvement, those sorts of factors, we're not seeing any changes in those systems. So what that tells us as practitioners, certainly what that tells me as a researcher, is that we still have a lot of work to do despite these gains, right? Despite these trends towards acceptance and affirmation and inclusion that we're seeing in the media and entertainment, and some other facets of society, we still have a long way to go. And once we start seeing those changes, once we start seeing fewer LGBTQI plus kids coming into the foster care system, once we start seeing lower rates of child maltreatment of LGBTQI plus youth, once we see fewer youth who are being trafficked, fewer youth who are homeless, I think that's when we'll really know that as a society, we're making the changes and the progress that we need to make. And so a couple of things to really kind of help us understand some of the factors of why there's such a strong overrepresentation of LGBTQI plus youth in the foster care system and what those experiences look like. Certainly we want to look at trauma experiences, we want to look at the mental health experiences, and we want to look at the maltreatment experiences. So let's start by talking a little bit about the mental health experiences of LGBTQI plus youth. And what we know is there are two diagnoses that LGBTQI plus youth still remain especially vulnerable to. And those, of course, are PTSD and major depression. These are certainly the two mental health or mental illnesses that we talk the most about, that we know the most about when it comes to LGBTQI plus youth. In fact, there's a big study out of Harvard. It's a couple years old now, 2016. At the Harvard School of Public Health, that found that LGBTQI plus youth in that study were 3.9 times, nearly 4 times as likely to meet clinical criteria for PTSD than non-LGBTQI plus youth. And just on average, when it comes to all mental illnesses, and this includes PTSD and depression, LGBTQI youth out there in the population today is nearly twice as likely to have some mental health diagnosis, some mental illness than non-LGBTQI plus young people. So, we're certainly still seeing major rates of disproportionality when it comes to diagnosis, but I think most importantly, depression and PTSD tend to be the two diagnoses that we're seeing the greatest rates of disproportionality. When we look at maltreatment, and I think this is important, this is probably one of the more important things that we'll talk about today. Every single form of child maltreatment that we measure in our child welfare system, whether it's physical abuse, or sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment, every single form of child maltreatment that we measure, LGBTQI plus youth still experience at disproportionately higher rates than non-LGBTQI plus youth. And there are some that are so incredibly disproportionate. When you look at family violence in particular, LGBTQI youth out there, especially teenagers, are nearly 5 times as likely to experience violence from a family member, typically a parent or a caretaker, than non-LGBTQI plus youth. When we look at homeless youth, this is a really good study out of University of Connecticut a couple years ago. Nearly 1 in 3 LGBTQI youth who were homeless reported that they were experiencing some form of physical, psychological, or sexual abuse at the time of their exit, either when they ran away or were kicked out of their homes. We're still seeing about 1 in 4 LGBTQI plus youth reporting some type of physical consequence or punishment when their caretakers, typically their parents, learn of their identity or learn of their sexual orientation. So we have a long way to go to address both the mental health needs, but also the maltreatment experiences of LGBTQI plus youth. The reality is that LGBTQI plus youth remain vulnerable to just about every single form of childhood maltreatment that we measure. And that's going to help us to better understand. It's not the only things. Those aren't the only things to help us understand this huge overrepresentation of why there are so many LGBTQI plus youth coming into the foster care system at such highly disproportionate rates, or why there are so many homeless LGBTQI plus youth, or why LGBTQI plus youth are so vulnerable to trafficking. But it does explain a lot, and it's certainly the place that I think we have to start to better understand those experiences. And we're going to kind of a little bit later on, we're going to kind of better break down what those pathways into care look like, because the reality is that while there certainly are going to be similarities across the board for all youth as they are vulnerable to child welfare involvement and what their pathways look like into care, there are some distinct things that we want to look at and that we want to address and we want to understand specific to LGBTQI plus youth that I think become really important, that I think a presentation like this one can help us better tease out and recognize and identify. So if we're talking about vulnerability, right, and we're talking about those risk factors, I think it's also important for us to recognize what those protective, what are the things that protect young people? What are the factors that are important, right, that can help keep young people from not only experiencing mental illness or behavioral health issues or foster care vulnerability or trafficking vulnerabilities, but also just overall wellness. Um, and the place, family acceptance remains the single most predictive and probably Um, so a team of researchers out at San Francisco University, San Francisco State University, led by Caitlin Ryan, who's a very prominent researcher in child welfare. They had seen the studies, the many studies up to that point, and we've seen many more since then, that I just cited there, right? That show that LGBTQI plus youth are so much more vulnerable to suicide. In fact, 1 in 3 teenagers that dies by suicide this year will be LGBTQI plus youth, a rate of disproportionality 3 times that of non-LGBTQI youth, which essentially means, again, that LGBTQI teens are 3 times as likely to die by suicide than non-LGBTQI plus youth. There is no factor, right? No, especially around identity, more predictive of both suicidal attempts and death by suicide than having an LGBTQI plus identity. They'd seen that research. They didn't want to replicate that again. They didn't want to run another study that shows, yeah, LGBTQI plus youth attempt suicide and die by suicide at disproportionately high rates. They didn't want to do another study that showed that LGBTQI plus youth are so much more vulnerable, so much more likely to meet clinical criteria for depression or anxiety, more likely to engage in risky behaviors like risky sex and risky substance abuse. Those studies had already been done at that point, and they've been done a whole bunch of times since this study was done. They said, we want to do something different. We want to, instead of assessing the relationship between a young person's sexual orientation, gender identity, and rates of suicide and suicidal ideation and depression and risky sex and risky substance abuse. In fact, we want to do something different. We want to assess what their family's level of acceptance was. And then we want to see if there's any difference in rates of suicidality, rates of depression, rates of risky sex, and rates of risky substance abuse there. And what they found was what I think, and I think what a lot of researchers and practitioners think, is one of the most seminal pieces of research on the experiences of LGBTQI plus youth that we've seen in a long time. Because after they gave these young people this battery of questions, 51 different questions that they were assessed, that essentially assessed their family's level of acceptance or rejection. And every young person, and there were a lot, I think it's a big sample size, very rigorous study. Every young person in this study was given an acceptance score, and those scores ranged from very accepting All right, these would be the parents who just caretakers who fully embrace their young person's identity, connect them to resources, talk openly, right? Have no double standards around relationships and hobbies and activities and all that sort of stuff. And it ranged all the way from that to very rejecting. And of course, very rejecting would certainly be those families who use silence and shame, potentially even abuse, right? Kicking their kids out of their homes, creating a really toxic, hostile home environment. And so every young person in this study got an acceptance score that ranged from very accepting to very rejecting. And what they found was that those young people whose families were very accepting, they were 8 times less likely to attempt suicide at some point before their 18th birthday than those young people whose families were very rejecting. They were nearly 6 times less likely to meet clinical criteria for depression if they had a very accepting family than those young people with very rejecting families. And when we look at behavioral health, when we look at risky health behaviors, right, risky behaviors, those young people with very accepting families 3.5 times less likely to engage in risky substance abuse and 3.5 times less likely to engage in risky sex that's associated with HIV infection. What they found was, in fact, that those young people who had accepting families were no more vulnerable to suicidality, to depression, to these risky behaviors like risky sex and risky substance abuse, the non-LGBTQI plus young people. That in fact, it's not a young person's identity, it's not their sexual orientation in particular in this study that predicts risk, suicide risk or depression risk or risky behavioral risk. It's what their family's level of acceptance and affirmation is. And the good news for us as clinicians and practitioners and social workers and counselors and caseworkers is we can do something with this research, right? There's a lot that we can do with this research because for many families, not all, for many families, we can help them to gain a better understanding of what it means to have a child who has an LGBTQI plus identity, what it means to be gay, or lesbian, or bisexual, or transgender, or gender non-binary. Right? We can help them to understand that their level of acceptance can be one of the most prominent, one of the most important factors that can help their child to be safe. Right? So let's look at this chart. I want to break this down for us a little bit. So this chart is looking at lifetime suicide attempts of young people in that study. And just like I said there, those with high rates of rejection were 8 times more likely than those with high rates of acceptance to have attempted suicide at some point before their 18th birthday. Now, some of you are going to look at this, as I did, and say, well, that's important to know. But the reality is, for many of the families that I work with, or many of the kids that come into the school that I'm working in, or the program that I'm working in, they're way over here. They're using shame and silence, and they refuse to talk about it, or they just refuse to accept and affirm their kid. There's absolutely no way impossible. There's no way possible that they would ever get to this point where right, they're basically leading the pride parade. And I get that. Now, for some families, they do. I just wrapped up a study of families, a small qualitative study, families who at one point in time, when they learned of their child's identity, they were over here. They were using silence. They refused to talk about it. Some of them even used shame and, told their kids that it wasn't okay and refused to accept it. And then over time, maybe months or sometimes even longer than that, they eventually got to the point where they would be just so incredibly accepting around everything. Right? And we try to kind of capture what went on there. Was it education? Were there certain experiences that you had? Was it counseling? What were those factors? What were those experiences that helped you move across this continuum to get from a point where you're very rejecting to a point where you're very accepting? And what we learned is that acceptance kind of happens upon a continuum. And yeah, maybe for some of those families who initially might be very rejecting, with some psychoeducation, with some counseling, with some education, with some experience, with some support, with the opportunity to normalize some of their experiences, to process some of those experiences, for many of them, they're going to move along this continuum, right? And maybe they will never quite make it over here, but let's imagine that we have a young person whose family is very rejecting, And with some work, right? Maybe somebody does some psychoeducation with them and helps them to recognize that the single biggest factor that could potentially keep their baby, their kid who they love, from being depressed or suicidal or engaging in risky sex or risky substance abuse is their level of acceptance and affirmation. And maybe they're learning a little bit more about the young person's identity. Maybe they're recognizing that the young person can have a happy and healthy life with an LGBTQI plus identity. All right. And they move over to this category. Well, what happens is, from a research standpoint, for that young person, their risk of suicide, if their parents just move into this somewhat accepting category, cuts 4 times. Now they're 4 times less likely to be vulnerable to suicide. When we look at risky drug use, it cuts their risk in half if we can help move that family along this continuum. All right. Same thing when we look at risky sex associated with HIV infection. Their risk is cut in half, even if they move to this somewhat accept. And we know this happens like a snowball, that for many of these families who move into this category, maybe eventually they're going to be over here, right? Where that young person's risk is not just low, it's their risk is even lower for risky sex or risky substance abuse or suicide or depression than non-LGBTQI plus youth, right? So I always tell people, as a researcher, I always say, when we have research, we have to bring it to life. We have to do something with it. And when you take something like this family acceptance, you can find all of this, if you Google the Family Acceptance Project, you can find all of this research, and they've done a lot more since then. There's so much that we can do. There's so many ways that we can bring this to life. And many times the place to start is to just sit down with families and to help them to recognize that the extent to which they accept and affirm their child can be the most important factor that can predict their babies, right? Their young person's risk of suicide or depression. I know before I came to St. Ed's, I worked on the border of my hometown in El Paso and helped start their MSW program. And we did a lot of this work with Hispanic, especially Catholic families on the border. And I can promise you that just that conversation right there was our most effective tool in really helping to generate some conversation, really help families to rethink their approach to some of this, or at a minimum, just be open to having a conversation in a different way. When you start with those aspects, as opposed to some of the other stuff that we might start with. So really just using this research, using this information to help begin a conversation or a dialogue with families can be an incredibly effective tool. So we're at our first 30-minute mark. So I want to check in to see if we have any questions. Any questions? And I can't see the chat with my screen shared, so if someone can just read them out if there are any in the chat. If not, we'll just keep moving along.
So far, we don't have any coming in.
Sounds good. We might have some in the next check-in. I'll check in again at the top of the hour to see if we have any more. All right, so now let's look at LGBTQI plus youth, specifically in the foster care system. Like I said before, there's no doubting the fact that we have overrepresentation. Now, what we're oftentimes going to hear from stakeholders in our state is, I oftentimes will talk to lawmakers or child welfare policy folks or administrators, and they say, well, it would really help if we had state-specific data. And I agree with that. I wish we knew exactly what percentage of teens in the Texas foster care system had LGBTQI identities, what our rate of disproportionality is, because these studies come from other states. Now, what I would say, and oftentimes do say in response to that, one of these studies was done in Washington State, one of these studies was done in California, I think the other one was done in Connecticut. When we look at, and that's where they were seeing rates of disproportionality 2 to 3 times for LGBTQI plus youth. When we look at that data, right, in a state like California or Connecticut or Washington or Oregon, it would be tough to make the argument that we're doing anything different in Texas that would make us think that we would, for any reason, have lower rates of disproportionality, because we know why there's the disproportionality. We know that it's rooted in family rejection. We know that it's rooted in kids being vulnerable through schools and other, social institutions. We know that there's strong um, religious components to that, all sorts of factors associated with that lead to that overrepresentation, none of which that we're addressing in the state of Texas, I don't think, in any way that's better than any of these other states. So I think despite the fact that we don't have that state level data, which we do need, I think we could probably safely assume that if we were to run this study in Texas, we would find similar rates of overrepresentation for LGBTQI plus young people. So as we look at those pathways into care, what we hear from LGBTQI plus youth is that just about half of them, 44%, say that their reason for coming into care had something to do with their SOGI. Either they are having conflict or tension with their parents, right? Their identity made them more vulnerable to abuse in some way. They were skipping school or missing school and kind of came on the radar of truancy officers or, whoever it might be. Teachers reported something. But for about half of LGBTQI young people who come into care, they're telling us in their own words that they're coming into care for something that had to do, or the reasons that they came into care had some connection to their identity. And so that would kind of align with what we were seeing in that previous data and some of those initial slides there. And I think the other thing to really kind of spend some time on and sort of break down is, as we look, as we kind of chart the path of youth as they come into foster care, really at every step of the way, we see some differences or some major challenges in terms of the dynamics for LGBTQI plus young people. So not only are we seeing disproportionately high referrals into the child welfare system, right, because young people are more vulnerable for all the reasons and all the factors that we just talked about in a lot more, but all along the way, we see major disparities in terms of their experiences, right? So when a young person, when we initiate an investigation, right, and the decision is made that a child's in an environment that's not safe, right, that there's going to have to be some separation, some removal there. Somebody just yell out what the best option tends to be for young people. If what is the least restrictive, most desirable option when we have to remove them? Someone can just unmute and yell it out. So I'm going to pretend somebody yelled out, we place them with family members, right? We place them in kinship care. Right. That is the most desirable, right? When we have to separate, when we have to remove, the most desirable next step is to place LGBT or to place youth with a family member, extended family member, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, right? Well, we see huge disparities with LGBTQI plus young people when it comes to kinship placement. And there are a couple of different factors for this. This is one that researchers, we're still kind of wrapping our head around, getting a better sense of. So the reality is that for many LGBTQI plus young people, what they tell me in the research that I do, the qualitative research especially, is that CPS especially sought out some of those options and asked those questions and saw if there were any relative caregivers that might be appropriate to place them with. But for many of them, their extended family, their aunts or uncles or grandma and grandpa, right, had a lot of the same barriers to acceptance and affirmation that their parents were having. And so those extended family options were a lot more limited for them, or kinship options were a lot more limited. At the same time, for many of them, and we've known this for a long time, right? There are some researchers who've done some great work around kind of operationalizing and help us to understand something called fictive kinship families, right? And these are families that youth kind of create on their own, right? So they may not be blood relatives, but these are the families that young people create, oftentimes out of adversity, oftentimes rooted in resiliency and protection that they sort of create on their own. And so what we see for a lot of LGBTQI plus young people is they have large fictive kinship networks, right? It might be their best friend's parents or a teacher at school, right? Or a coach or someone else who they really see as their family, even though they're not a blood relative, but and who maybe with some support with those kinship resources, which we need more of in the state of Texas, but with support with some of those resources, especially the financial resources, right, could potentially be caregivers, which could potentially prevent young people, especially young LGBTQI plus young people, from going into a system that we're going to see here in a second oftentimes does more harm than it does good for them. And so this is a point where we talk about some of those policies, some of those practice recommendations that would come out of a presentation like this. What are some things that we can do within our organization? Maybe what are some things that I can do in my own practice? And certainly structurally, systemically, what are some of the policy things that we can do? We really, if we were to change this dynamic, or if we were to begin to address this dynamic in a meaningful way, we would really begin to expand the way that we think about and the way that we address kinship and listen to young people when they talk about family or who their support system is. Be more expansive, right, and more inclusive in terms of who we look at. And then, of course, and this is out of the realm of any of our control in this group, provide more resources to those potential caregivers, because this is important. This could prevent young people, so many young people, from coming into care at such disproportionately high rates, and prevent them from coming into a system, like I said, that we're going to see here in a second, isn't quite ready to provide them with the resources and the environment to secure their safety and their well-being and their permanence even. So that's the first step, right? And also when we make that separation, whether we place a kid into kinship care or we have to put them into foster care, right? The next best thing is to work with their family to try to reunite young people with their families, right? That's ultimately, for most young people, once that separation is made, their goal is initially going to be reunification with their family. And what we know is that LGBTQI plus youth, for a variety of reasons, again, are significantly less likely to ever be reunited with their families. Now, some of that is pretty obvious why. All right. And it's rooted in the rejection, and it's rooted in, all of those factors. In this is a statistic to some degree that I can understand. But at the same time, what we know and what I hear from young person after young person, I've interviewed over 140 young people who have lived in or aged out of the Texas foster care system just in the last 5 years, and asked them these different questions. What I hear over and over and over again when I ask them, hey, what did the CPS intervention or what did the child welfare intervention look like with your family? And for many of them, either there was very little or no intervention with the family, or the intervention didn't really address any of those factors around family rejection, right? And so when we look at how we intervene with families, it kind of falls under that umbrella of parental dysfunction, which makes sense for a lot of reasons. Right? We think about domestic violence, or mental illness, or substance abuse, or intimate partner violence in the home, other parenting, some of these other factors. I know I missed a couple there, right? All of that falls under that umbrella of what we call parental dysfunction. We got to find a better term. We got to find a more social work term for that. And when we look at the experiences of many LGBTQI plus young people, their experiences might look a little bit different. Not to say that there aren't aspects of those dynamics that are at play here, but for many of them, their identity, their sexual orientation, their gender identity is really at the core, right? How their family responded to that is at the core of some of the factors that led to their vulnerability and led to their separation and their removal. And what we know is that, and this isn't just specific to our state, this is across the nation, that the child welfare system isn't necessarily doing a good job at addressing those specific factors, right? The services that we're offering aren't addressing the family rejection. Therefore, that's could be some of the reason why young people are about half as likely to be with LGBTQI plus identities, about half as likely to be reunited with their family if separation does take place. Also, they're being removed, typically a little bit older on average. We know that older kids could be a lot less likely to be reunited, in other factors there that we touched on at the beginning of that conversation. But that's not to say that there isn't stuff that we can be doing, right? Are we taking out that family acceptance research? Are we offering family therapy? Are we working with these families to address, ideological factors or whatever it might be, that are contributing to that rejection? And for many young people, the answer to that question is going to be no. When we look at permanency in general, we have a lot of work to do. All right, so let's keep going down this pathway. So we know, if a young person has to be removed, that ideally we want to place them with kinship, and we know that LGBTQI plus youth are about half as likely to be placed with kinship caregivers as non-LGBTQI plus youth. We know that they're removed. Ideally, for most young people, we want to reunite them with their family if possible. And we know that LGBTQI plus youth are over twice as likely, less likely to be placed back with their family, reunited with their family. So then what is the next best option for them? If we can't reunite them with their family, or we can't place them with kinship care, it's to put them into traditional foster care placements. And this is where we see some of the biggest disparities for LGBTQI plus young people. All right. One, we do not have the family placements that we need, families that are affirming, accepting, and equipped to provide affirming and accepting and inclusive care to LGBTQI plus young people. So we see a lot of placement disruption throughout the course of their experiences. This first bullet here, you can see over half, this was a study that we did, this is a couple years old now, but over half of LGBTQI plus youth, when asked about their most recent placement disruption, why it broke down, they identified that the breakdown had something to do with factors associated with their SOGI, either their foster parents weren't accepting or affirming, they were having tension or conflict with their peers, there was something going on in the school that was leading to tension or conflict, or skipping or truancy or whatever it may have been. So we have to do a better job in terms of how we train families. We have to do a better job in terms of how we place young people with families, the questions that we're asking to help ensure that a placement is going to be accepting and affirming. I'll tell you a story that's really, really old. This happened over 15 years ago. But I was working with a private foster care agency, a new MSW, um, and I was just driving across the state, and my agency knew that I was driving. I'd gone to do a visit out in Abilene, and I was driving back, and they knew I was coming back, and they had a young person that needed to be their time was expiring at that time at an emergency shelter, and they had a foster home for him, and it was kind of right on my path back home. So they said, Adam, can you pick this kiddo up at the emergency shelter outside Abilene there and drop him off at this foster home in a town in between here in Abilene, in between Austin and Abilene. And so I picked him up, and he's a 16-year-old kid. And in the course of our conversation, he had mentioned that he was gay, that he had a boyfriend, and he asked me, and I didn't know him, he didn't know me. He had been through this process of placement quite a few times. I think he said that this was something like his sixth or seventh place that he'd lived since he'd been in foster care for 2 years. And he said, "Do you think that the foster parents could meet halfway so that I could see my boyfriend?" And this is 15 years ago. And I said, "Well, I'm going to ask because I think that's a fair ask because it's only an hour and a half drive if you met halfway." And maybe they'd be willing to do that. And I kind of explained the rules and said, they don't have an obligation to do that as far as I can tell. I called the supervisor or the caseworker for his case, and they said, that's one of those things that's going to be up to the foster parents. And so we were sitting down doing a quick placement. Of course, I thought this was going to be a quick drop off. And as I was talking to the foster parents and I asked that question, the foster dad said, "Oh yeah, we read that in the file, something about that, and we're going to take care of that real quick." And it didn't give me much comfort in terms of how he said that. I don't think he was saying that. And I just wanted to kind of follow up and say, "You take care of the transportation and meet him halfway." And he just kind of smiled and said, "No, you know what I mean." And I said, "No, I don't know what you mean." He said, "We'll make sure that we take care of this gay thing real quick." And then I knew what he meant. I'm not always the quickest to pick up on stuff. And so, of course, I realized that I can't leave this kid in this placement. In fact, he and I drove around for 2 days before there was a place that I felt comfortable leaving him. at. So, all of that to say is we have to do a better job. I talk with foster parents about this topic all the time, and oftentimes, and it's getting better because of trainings like this. And I'm so glad, that Gladney's doing this presentation. And a lot of organizations and a lot of agencies are having conversations that we've never had in the past, and that's really exciting. And we're going to see the fruits of that labor. I can assure you. But it's not uncommon for me to talk to a group of foster parents and kind of ask them or poll them about the level of training that they've gotten around LGBTQ plus identity. Have you gotten specific training on how to provide affirming and accepting care? Have you gotten specific training about, the specific trauma experiences of LGBTQI plus youth and what trauma informed care looks like for LGBTQI and all of those sorts of factors? And overwhelmingly, for most foster parents, that they haven't gotten much of that. Some of them haven't gotten any of that, and most of them certainly haven't gotten enough of that training and insight to be able to provide the types of placements that LGBTQI plus youth really need in order to experience and feel that sense of acceptance and affirmation and inclusion. Overall, LGBTQI plus youth experience about 2.3 times as many placement disruptions as non-LGBTQI plus youth. And so we're seeing a lot of bouncing around the system. And then the big one, and one of the most important ones, and this is certainly something really important context for us to understand in the state of Texas, is the over-reliance on congregate care placements and group home placements. So nationally, and again, we don't have state-level data. I would venture to guess that it's pretty similar here in Texas. Nationally, over 70%, or right at 70%, of LGBTQI plus teenagers who are in the foster care system, their current placement is in what would be considered a group home or a congregate care placement. And that is a huge rate of disproportionality. In fact, when we think about the racial disproportionality work that's been done over the course of the last 10 years, which has been so phenomenal and so exceptional, and they talk about, Black youth and Native American youth being disproportionately placed in group home and congregate care placements, that even the rate of disproportionality of congregate care placements for LGBTQI plus youth is significant, about twice that of youth of color, Black youth and Native American youth in particular, who are the two most vulnerable racial groups to be placed in congregate care. No group is more vulnerable to being placed into congregate care or group home settings than LGBTQI plus youth. Right? And that's a dynamic that we certainly see in Texas. Most of the young people who I study, in fact, I'm going to reference a study here where nearly all of the young people who I interviewed for that study at some point in time were placed in a foster group home or a congregate care placement. Now, I also feel it's important to kind of, coming from that world and having lived in that world and worked in that world, and been a caretaker in congregate care or group homes, I'm not someone who just completely doesn't see the necessity of those programs, but the reality is that for most young people, right, a more ideal placement, a less restrictive placement would be with a family, traditional placement with a family, right, with maybe fewer kids, not having 8 or 10 other young people in the home. And the simple fact is we're just not doing that for LGBTQI plus youth. It becomes much easier. And don't get me wrong. I mean, there have been many instances when I was a social worker where I placed a youth who had an LGBTQI plus identity in a group home because it was clearly the best placement option for them, because I couldn't find any other family placements for them. I mean, we're in the state of Texas right now. We don't have enough placements for kids in general, right? But it's significantly worse for LGBTQI plus youth. So we have to address that. We have to figure out, one, what are the factors contributing to why so many LGBTQ plus youth are going into group homes, going into congregate care placements? How are we going to better equip and recruit families who can provide accepting and affirming care to LGBTQI plus youth, so that we can change that dynamic? Because congregate care group home placements still tend to be much less or much more restrictive, much more institutional than family placements. And so we have to do a better job of offering youth, though, finding those opportunities for young people. And when they are in family placements, providing the services and the support that they need for those placements not to disrupt. Because again, those placements are disrupting at about twice the rate as non-LGBTQI plus young people. in Texas, we also have the religious refusal bill that passed in 2017. And that can, you know, have a really profound influence on LGBTQ youth for a variety of factors, not just because, agencies don't have to license, um, families based upon their identity, right? What we do know is that gay and lesbian families, individuals, couples in particular, are much more likely to be foster parents for LGBTQI plus youth. When we look at rates of like disruption, if you have an LGBTQI plus youth who's placed with gay or a gay individual or a couple, lesbian individual, right? Their placement breakdown is no different at that point than non-LGBTQI plus young people. That's really important research that we want to engage here. So, structurally, systemically, and I know that this is out of the realm of the control of a lot of people in a presentation like this, by cutting off those families, by not allowing them or providing them with the support and the opportunity to be foster or adoptive parents, that has a residual effect on LGBTQI plus youth. And the bill also allows families not to provide affirming and accepting care if doing so doesn't align with their strongly held religious beliefs. And that becomes problematic, going back to the family acceptance slide, because acceptance is the single biggest factor that contributes to the wellness and the safety and the mental health and the behavioral health of LGBTQI plus young people. So, by having the option to not provide affirming and accepting care, that becomes really, really problematic, and would help us to understand why youth have breakdown rates that are so high, why they're running away, being kicked out, having conflict, some of those sorts of factors. So all of this is just to get at, so much of this is just systemic. It's just so structural that in order to have really, not to say, you know, I think sometimes when we say something systemic or structural, when you attend a presentation like this, you think, well, there's not much I can do. No, there's a lot that we can do at a personal level, at an individual level, at an organizational level. But if we're going to see really meaningful changes, uh, at a structural, at a macro level, it's going to take us making some major structural changes in terms of policy, in terms of practice, in terms of norms out there to really change this at a meaningful macro level. All right. So I do want to talk about trafficking because there's such a strong intersection between LGBTQI plus youth in the foster care system, homeless youth, and youth who are vulnerable to trafficking and youth who are trafficking. Homelessness is the most prominent risk factor for child trafficking. Right, so between 73 to 86% of teenagers and young adults under the age of 22 who report trafficking experiences um, have at least one experience of homeless. Many of them were homeless at the time, of course, that they experienced trafficking. Well, this becomes really, really important to us, especially in the state of Texas, because no population is more vulnerable to homelessness than LGBTQI plus youth. In fact, 45% of, if you go out on and look at homeless teens under the age of 20, young adults too, under the age of 22 in the state of Texas, 45% of those young people are going to have LGBTQ plus identities. So if homelessness is the single biggest risk factor, now this isn't the only factor that we're going to look at. We're going to start looking at some of those more interpersonal factors as well here in a second. But if homelessness is the single biggest risk factor to being vulnerable to trafficking, and we have a population who is far more vulnerable to homelessness than any other, right? It's going to help us to better understand why so many of the trafficking victims in our state are LGBTQI plus youth. We want to understand those structural, those systemic elements. This is also important because when we look at our efforts to address trafficking, now some of them do a great job of addressing kind of the intersections of sexual orientation and gender identity and race and some of those other factors, but some of those initiatives and some of those programs haven't done quite as good of a job of doing that, right? And so if we know that, and there are a variety of factors for that, right? If we look at the two groups who are most vulnerable to trafficking, LGBTQI plus youth, and besides homeless youth, LGBTQI plus youth, and in youth out of the foster care system, youth in the foster care system, right? It's pretty easy to recognize why, as a state, especially with our politicians, why they tend to be reluctant to acknowledge that, right? Where our state is an ongoing lawsuit now. What are we going on? 6 years now, 5, 6 years now, that our state, maybe longer than that, that our state has had this lawsuit that has said your foster care system's really, really bad, right? So if we have a trafficking initiative, they're going to be a lot less reluctant to provide the resources and to acknowledge that a lot of those kids who are experiencing trafficking are coming out of this foster care system that they're trying to defend and say isn't that bad. And then, of course, with the LGBTQ, the reality is, especially at a legislative level, our legislator has had a lot of anti-LGBTQ plus youth policies, right, and bills over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. And so my concern, my worry is that we're not doing a great job in many of these initiatives at addressing two of the populations that are most vulnerable there, if that makes sense. So those are some of the more structural dynamics. When we look specifically at homeless youth, LGBTQI plus youth are about 3 times as likely to engage in what we refer to as street economies or survival behavior, survival sex, engaging in sex for residence, sex for substances, sex for transportation, sex for toiletries, whatever it might be. And we also know that, of course, and this makes sense, that durations of homelessness make young people much more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. Well, LGBTQI plus youth who are homeless typically are homeless for twice the duration of non-LGBT, which just means that they're on the streets longer. They don't have a place to stay longer, which makes them a lot more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation, sex for residents, some of that sort of stuff. There are other factors as well. So if you're thinking, man, he's really focusing on the systemic stuff, and I was hoping we would focus a lot more on the interpersonal stuff, don't worry, because the whole second half of this presentation is all going to be the interpersonal trauma stuff. And then, of course, one more slide here addressing some of the more macro stuff. When we look at the intersections of race and homelessness with LGBTQI plus youth, I kind of plucked out what I thought were some of the most important components of that research. And we know that youth of color, Black youth in particular, who are LGBTQI, have the highest rates of homelessness and housing and of instability of any youth population that we look at. LGBTQ plus youth of color are about half as likely to be out, especially to family members, and are out to far fewer people. And if you say, well, why is that important? What the research actually tells us is that young people who are out are typically much less vulnerable to maltreatment, much less vulnerable to exploitation, homelessness, than those young people who aren't out. And the more people that you're out to with support also is a huge protective factor as well. Youth of color much more vulnerable to participating in street economies, and about twice as likely to have what they refer to as, or what is referred to as, bad encounters with shelters, institutions, programs, either where they're turned away or they have some type of bad experience, which can range from, discrimination, microaggression, all the way to like maltreatment or abuse. These are the factors that are most associated with trafficking, vulnerability, of course, homelessness, or some of the factors for LGBTQI plus youth, of course, homelessness, family rejection, trauma. That's the one we're really going to focus the last part of this presentation on. Child welfare involvement, and a lack of social support. So I want to check in again. We're right at the top of the hour. The last 30 minutes is really going to focus on some of those interpersonal factors, really going to focus on what trauma-informed care looks like for LGBTQI plus youth in the foster care system, what a trauma-informed system would look like. But I do want to take a second to see if we have any questions that have come up.
If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat for us. We did have a couple throughout that you might have got to, but is there any data about the incidence of abuse of LGBTQ plus youth before and after coming out?
Yeah. In fact, 1 in 4, that's a great question. 1 in 4, this is a little dated, it's 2015, so it's about 5, 6 years old now. 1 in 4 LGBTQI plus youth will experience some form of physical punishment. Typically, in many of them would probably be considered physical abuse, when their caretakers learn of their identity, whether they've come out or they've learned of it in some other way. So I would imagine if we were to conduct that same study today, that data would probably hold up. It'd still be pretty similar. It's a great question.
And then we had one more. What is a good resource for information that we can give to youth and their families? Also, what are some organizations in the DFW area that support families through the education support process?
All right. The place that I would often start would be the Family Acceptance Project. And what I like about the Family Acceptance Project, and if you just Google Family Acceptance Project, it'll take you right to their webpage. They have specific resources for social workers and counselors and school counselors. They even have guides in terms of how to use their research to engage conversations with families. So they've got great literature for families to read. So I think that would be a good place to start. In terms of resources in the DFW area, I don't know because I'm in Austin, um, but I bet we could, if you email me, I can get you in touch with some colleagues who can help you find some specific resources. We're probably going to have a wealth of information as well from others. So if you know of great resources or if you've had good experiences with providers in the community and you want to put those in the chat, that would be great.
Perfect. I think that's all we have for now, but Adam, I will put your email in the chat for them as well.
Thank you. Okay. So what I want to do now, and I think this is going to be really, really helpful because this really helps me to in doing this research has really helped me to better understand. When we talk about something like trafficking vulnerability, it's one thing to understand the structural and systemic aspects, all the stuff that we've talked about up to this point, and that's so important. I mean, I would never minimize. I'm going to spend my whole career, researching that and trying to understand that and grasp that. But I think sometimes we miss out on some of the interpersonal dynamics, some of the interpersonal factors and things that are going on that can contribute to this vulnerability. And so essentially, I want us to help get a sense of what this looks like from an individual standpoint, from a clinical standpoint for a lot of LGBTQI plus youth. So I'm going to kind of break down the grooming tactics that we know of that traffickers use to recruit and exploit young people and really kind of help look at the experiences that LGBTQI plus youth, especially those who have an extensive rejection history or trauma history, what might make them so much more vulnerable to these tactics in these strategies that traffickers use. And I'll start by saying that traffickers, in terms of the tactics and the strategies that they use, they're oftentimes so manipulative. The best comparison that I have is that anybody who's done work in the area of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, like as soon as you start doing that work, you realize right away. You may have studied the power and control wheel. You may have read somewhere or heard somewhere, wow, these individuals can be incredibly manipulative and use flirtation and flattery and coercive control and all of that sort of stuff. But it's really not until you've worked with them and you've seen, right, or you've talked to survivors and just seen how effective that they've been that you really get a sense of just how manipulative and how controlling and how essentially good they are at what they do. Um, and if you've done trafficking work, you recognize really quickly as well that this is the same dynamic. It's very similar dynamic. So traffickers are oftentimes going to be so far ahead of the game, so far, so advanced in terms of how they exploit, how they manipulate, how they can, exploit things like family rejection or a trauma history or a young person who doesn't have a support system or a young person who has a low self-esteem, right, or a young person who has internalized homophobia or transphobia or whatever it might be. It's just really alarming. So I'm going to try to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So among the most effective tactics and strategies and most common tactics and strategies that we see with traffickers is to offer a sense of family and a sense of community to young people. And it's not tough for us, I think, to make the connection here. Why? For many LGBTQ plus young people, especially many who have experienced rejection from their families, many who've experienced trauma, many who don't have a strong support system why it would be so effective for these traffickers to offer a sense of family, how that would essentially kind of hit differently for them, having a sense of community, offering to meet a youth's needs to build a sense of trust and dependency. For so many young people, they don't have somebody who they can trust and somebody who they can depend upon. So it becomes much easier for traffickers to exploit this dynamic. And then this last one I think is really important. And I tell this to foster care people, right? When we talk foster care workers all the time, when we talk about why so many kids in foster care are so vulnerable to trafficking, right? Offering that sense of protection, that sense of safety, which traffickers are so good at, right? And it oftentimes, right, the cornerstone, the foundational component of their recruitment and their tactics. Well, offering a sense of protection and safety is typically only going to be effective for those young people who need a sense of protection and a sense of safety. And the harsh reality is that for so many LGBTQI plus youth is they need protection and they need safety because they're not protected and they're not safe. And this tactic becomes so much more effective. Let's get a little further into some of the more um, or lesser known tactics that we see. Strategic use of humiliation and degradation. We see this all the time with traffickers. This becomes much easier for young people who have experienced a sense of shame, especially shame around their identity. Young people who have experienced a sense, or not experienced, who have experienced trauma, right? So that strategic use of shame, that strategic use of humiliation, that strategic use of degradation can be so effective. Normalize trauma and violence, right? This is one that we don't talk about enough. I see it in the studies that I do with young people all the time, that when trauma has been normalized, and the reality is that for many LGBTQI plus youth, when we look at their rates of trauma, especially acute trauma, but not just acute trauma, and I'll talk in a second about the difference between acute and chronic stress. And the reality is that for so many LGBTQI plus youth, they're vulnerable, disproportionately vulnerable to both of those forms of trauma and stress, that trauma has become very normalized for many of them. And for many of them, that trauma has not only become normalized, it's done so with a complete sense of impunity. Nothing's ever been done to address the trauma that they've experienced, or the abuse that they've experienced, or the emotional abuse that they've experienced, or the rejection from their families that they've experienced, or the bullying that they've experienced. So there's no expectation that anything's going to be done about that anyway. All right, these are some of the more interpersonal clinical dynamics that are going on. Creating a dynamic of distrust of others, that essentially the only person you can trust is me. Well, that becomes a lot easier if you've grown up your whole life without being able to trust, especially the very people that you should be able to trust and confide in and rely upon the most. Exploitation of intimate disclosures. I think this one's pretty obvious what some of those intimate disclosures could potentially be. Strategic use of trauma bonding, right? Power and shame, power dynamics. We see these sort of interpersonal tactics all the time. Creating emotional isolation from a young person's support system. The physical isolation, right, only comes after the emotional isolation, right? So creating that emotional isolation, hey, creating this distance from your family or your support system, right? That can become a lot easier for traffickers and for perpetrators and predators, right? If there's already this tension, this hostility, this distrust that exists there. We already talked about secrecy of intimate disclosures, um, exploiting a young person's lack of belonging and sense of alienation, financial destitution. Of course, if you've already run away, you're on the streets. We know that young people are twice as likely to engage in street economies with LGBTQI plus identities. So exploiting that financial destitution becomes a lot easier. Exploiting fears around repercussions for reporting. And this is a dynamic that still so many LGBTQI plus young people have grown up with their entire lives. And then this last one, and I think this one's important as well, exploiting a young person's fears and assumptions that they're not going to be believed, even if they do say something. And the reality is that we see this for a lot of LGBTQI plus young people, and I think it comes from that sense of impunity that they've experienced their whole lives. It's a very similar dynamic. I have a colleague at St. Ed's who does incredible research with migrant refugee families, and for many of them who've experienced both trauma in their country of origin, trauma along their migration to the U.S., and even trauma that they experience here, maybe at the border or elsewhere, when they do have experiences of, say, domestic violence or child abuse or something like that, that because that violence has become so normalized, because that trauma trauma has been treated with complete impunity, and that victimization has been treated with complete impunity, in their countries of origin, on the way here, and even here in the United States, that they don't expect anybody to do anything. So they're going to be a lot less likely to come forward, or a lot more reluctant to even report something or expect anybody to do something with that information. Just a little bit more data here. This one I probably should have thrown in a previous slide, but LGBTQI plus youth are 7.5 times as likely than non-LGBTQI plus youth to experience sexual violence during their childhood. So what I wanted to kind of get at is just the high rates of trauma and the need for really trauma-informed care. So this is a small study that my colleagues and I just wrapped up, and we were looking specifically at the trafficking experiences of LGBTQI plus youth who had been in the foster care system. And nearly 90% of those young people had experiences of family rejection with their family of origin. Similarly, about 74% of them were in foster placements at some point where they experienced some form of rejection. On average, they had nearly 6 placements between them, an average of 6 placements. And nearly 80% of them, 78%, had lived in a congregate care placement at some point in time. And over half of them, their longest placement was in a congregate care group home setting. All right, so let's close out by talking about what trauma-informed care looks like with LGBTQI plus youth in the foster care system. One, and I think this is one of the most important ones, right? And we all know this. I mean, we're all trained in trauma-informed care. It's the first thing that we say, and it's one of the most seminal, most important things. But that trauma is rooted in survival. The hallmark feature of traumatic stress is the perception of threat, oftentimes in incidents and circumstances where really no threat exists there. Well, this is one of those things where foundationally, if we take a step back and we change our frame and we look at the behaviors of LGBTQI plus young people, those who are homeless, those who are in the foster care system, maybe even those who are running away from placements, that, not going to school, whatever it might be, if we take a step back and we have a real appreciation for this dynamic around survival, and we recognize that so many of their behaviors are rooted in survival, it can completely change, right, our frame and our framework in terms of how we understand them. And we can be a lot more empowering. We can be a lot more strengths-based. We can have a lot more appreciation and respect for the decisions that even if we know that they're not best for them, right? That's not how empowerment works, right? That's not how strength-based practice works. That's not how trauma-informed care works, right? We still recognize the risk in certain behaviors, but we have a complete trauma-informed care. What it does more than anything else, it gives us a complete appreciation and understanding, because we understand that neurobiology, we understand how intrusive and how invasive trauma is, and how it changes kids' perceptions, how it changes their behaviors, how it changes their relationships, how it changes their sense of self, right? And how, and especially, when we can recognize that those behaviors, those relation decisions rooted in survival, we can have a lot more understanding and a lot more respect and a lot more appreciation for where they're coming from. We also want to recognize that traumatic stress can look different for LGBTQI plus youth. This is so important, for any population of youth, right? One of the first things you learn in trauma-informed care is, there's the clinical side. There's all the things neurobiologically, physiologically, psychologically that trauma does to a child, right? The changes to their brain, all of that sort of stuff. And we have to address that. But there's also the environmental side to this, that kids who remain in environments that are saturated and riddled with all of these stressors and all of these trauma triggers and all of these reminders, right, and all of these other factors, that it's going to be hard for them to heal and to cope and to get better, right, and to have that sense of safety and that sense of wholeness and that sense of wellness if they remain in environments that are just saturated with all of these stressors and all of these triggers. And the reality for many LGBTQI plus youth, especially those who are in the foster care system, especially those who are homeless, is that for many of them, they're living in environments that are saturated with those stressors and those triggers. So our intervention doesn't need to address only the psychological, the clinical aspects. We also have to be just as meaningful and just as intentional at addressing those environmental aspects as we can. When we talk about triggers, those mundane, those ordinary things that now all of a sudden, because a child has a lower order trauma experience, an acute trauma experience especially, that all of a sudden serve as, right, these painful reminders, these scary reminders, right, these shameful reminders that the reality is that given the complex nature, given the fact that LGBTQI plus youth, you know, speaking in general terms, but especially those in the foster care system, for many of them, they've had such complex trauma experiences that they're going to have a lot of triggers and a lot of stressors. And we want to be mindful of that, and we want to be sensitive to that. This one is one that I think is so important. When we talk about trauma, traumatic stress, when we really break it down to some of its most foundational levels, we know that it's an emotional experience. When a child experiences traumatic stress, they're re-experiencing the same, not just memories, fragmented, choppy imagery and memories and flashbacks of the trauma that they experience, especially if it's acute trauma, but also they're re-experiencing the same emotions and the same thoughts. So the same fear and the same sadness and the same anger and the same shame and the same confusion and the same sense of responsibility that they experienced during that initial trauma, right? And that trauma and traumatic stress, when you're re-experiencing these overwhelming emotions and these overwhelming thoughts, are an emotional experience. The problem is we've designed our system so much to address, right, the behavioral dynamics, that oftentimes we miss out on opportunities to recognize that those behaviors that we see, whether it's running away, whether it's sabotaging a placement, right, whether it's picking a fight with whatever it might be, that oftentimes those behaviors, not only are they rooted in survival, right, but those behaviors are nothing more than a way to try to alleviate and deal with these overwhelming emotional experiences related to that trauma and traumatic stress. We can't forget that. So our interventions have to focus on those emotions and those thoughts and not just be behavioral. And I worry when I think about the juvenile justice system, the foster care system, the school system, that we're not doing enough of that. We talk, when we talk about trauma and traumatic stress, we've done such a good job in recent years of talking about, hey, there are really two types of trauma that kids experience. For many kids in the foster care system, certainly for many LGBTQI plus youth, their trauma experiences are very complex. Not only are those acute experiences, right, acute stress, things like physical abuse or sexual abuse or domestic violence or combat violence, those would all be examples of acute stress where there's immediate stress to your safety and your well-being, right, your safety. Then there's the chronic stress, that ongoing, right? You think about post-traumatic where there's no post, right? Kids who live in chronic poverty, chronic homelessness, kids who live in the shadows of immigration. For many LGBTQI plus youth, growing up in an environment that is rejecting, constantly walking on eggshells, where that lower order system is constantly on alert. Well, we're not, the reason why, both of these forms of stress and trauma have such similar effects on a child's brain, all right, is because we're not wired for either one of these types of stress. We're only wired for stress in two ways. We're wired for stress that up to a certain threshold, right? And once an experience goes beyond that threshold, something like combat violence or sexual assault or physical abuse or domestic violence, right? It becomes a lower order system. It becomes a traumatic experience and it's processed in that lower order system, right? And it gets stored in that way because we're only wired for stress up to a certain threshold, in much the same way that we're only wired for stress that is temporary. We're not wired for stress that is ongoing. We're not wired for stress, right, that doesn't have an end to it. And for so many LGBTQI plus youth, whether they're living in constant fear of abuse or constant fear of somebody learning of their identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, somebody um, uh, finding something out, whatever it might be, that for many of them, not only do they have those acute forms of stress, but for many of them, they also have a combination of the chronic stress, and that becomes very complex. So we're going to see the hyperarousal stuff, hyperarousal symptoms, things like hypervigilance and impulsivity and some of those sorts of things. But we're also going to see a lot of the dissociative symptoms. The more complex the trauma, typically, the more complex the symptomology of trauma, right? I mean, that's pretty simple. So we're going to see the hyperarousal stuff, but we're also going to see the dissociative stuff. And of course, with dissociative traumatic stress, right, when a child dissociates, essentially what's happening is the brain is preparing the body for injury. Right. And so, if we were having this presentation in a classroom and a tiger were to come through the door, some of us might have a dissociative response for that, right? Our brains would prepare our body from the injury that we're about to experience from this tiger. And it's a great function of our brain and in our body. slow down the heart rate, slow down the blood flow, send this mass amount of opioids throughout the body, right? Slow down the blood so that it will preserve blood for this injury that we're about to experience, a great function of our brain and our body. But remember, the hallmark feature of traumatic stress is the perception and the response to stress, right, or threat that simply doesn't exist. So for many young people, when they have dissociative symptomology, that's exactly what's going on with them. I'm going to just do a couple more here and leave a little bit of time for any last questions. We've talked about a lot about emphasizing danger and safety. I can't stress this enough. Especially from a trauma-informed care perspective, especially for youth in the system, youth who are homeless, youth who are being trafficked. For many of them, so much of their worlds are kind of rooted in fear and danger, and so many of their responses to that are rooted in that survival. Bruce, my favorite quote from the Bruce Perry book, and I know a group like this is probably really likes Bruce Perry. If you're anything like me, I can't get enough of it. He's got a new book out that I just is even better than the first couple books that he wrote. And if you're not familiar with Bruce Perry, he's a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist out of Houston who's just done incredible work, probably work as good as anyone else around childhood trauma. But he has a quote in The Boy Who Was Raised as the Dog, his most popular book. And he says that kids prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. In nearly every study that I do with LGBTQI plus youth, I'm reminded of this, especially as it relates to the trauma. The kids who experience trauma prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. And kind of what he's getting at here is that kids will go to incredible lengths. They're wired to try to make everything understandable and predictable, right? And we're all wired that way, right? And even when, or especially when it comes to something like childhood trauma, that's so unpredictable, right? That's so far out of their control. Oftentimes, kids are going to do stuff to try to regain some sense of control. And oftentimes, the stuff that they do would baffle us. Right? You think about placement sabotage, you think about kids running away, you think about kids doing all sorts of things to test limits and to test boundaries. All of it rooted in trying to gain some sense of external control and internal control over their worlds, right? And when Perry says that kids prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty, I think for so many LGBTQI plus youth who are in the system, this one becomes so important. Not knowing what's going to happen, not having any power or any say over how things are going to happen, what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, can be absolutely crazy making for so many young people. Right? And we have to help them to regain that sense of power, regain that sense of control. But we also have to recognize the role that this control plays. And this is for all kids that you work. If you work in the foster care system, you see this day in and day out. I've said, for 20 years now, if there was one thing that I wish every caregiver and every caseworker out there could understand when it comes to kids in the foster care system, it's the lengths and the extent that they will go to try to gain some sense of control over both their internal and their external worlds. Once we understand that, once we have a grasp on that, all of their behaviors make so much more sense to us. Not only that, we understand those behaviors in a way where it can be so much more empowering and so much more strengths-based, right? Because, we can essentially say, hey, not only do I know why you might be doing the things that you're doing, but I think it says a whole hell of a lot about you and how resilient you are and how resourceful you are and everything that you're doing to try to survive a world that has been unfair to you and unpredictable to you and so far out of your control. So we'll close there. I know I got a couple more slides on here. So feel free to take a look at those, but I do want to leave at least 5 minutes for last questions here. A lot of time, depending on where you're at, so here in Austin, if a family were to ask me that question, I would start in the schools because we're seeing more and more, pride groups in schools and in a lot of times some of those groups will be a little bit more focused on advocacy. Most of them are going to be more focused on support or some mix of the two, but oftentimes that's a great place to start. But I think finding any group that is going to be focused on support becomes so important because, and what those next couple slides we're going to talk about, those experiences of normalizing for LGBTQI plus youth becomes so important. Obviously offering a sense of community, but also externalizing what we're seeing more and more in these support groups with LGBTQI plus youth. There's a great study that's being done right now with trans youth and parents of trans youth, that is just really capturing how meaningful and how impactful normalizing and then externalizing those experiences. And for a lot of the young people that I've talked to who have been involved in support groups or support efforts, or who have created an accepting and affirming community for them, you can kind of see their capacity to be able to externalize their experience and be able to say, hey, the things that were done to me, whether it was family rejection or being bounced around the foster care system or being bullied at school, those aren't my issues. Those are the issues of someone else. Those are things that were done to me. You know, we haven't teased that out in the research, but I think, I mean, we're counselors, we're social workers, we're caseworkers in here. We're wise enough to recognize why that can be so meaningful and so empowering for young people. So while I don't, it's going to be specific to your community, I can't encourage people enough to get young people connected with as many support groups as they're willing to be involved with.